Good morning, subscribers. Geekonomics here once again, and carrying on with the chosen theme at the moment, which is of course labour markets and labour market theory. So in my previous video I looked at transfer earnings and economic rent, and in this particular video I'm going to be looking at the whole notion of a maximum wage. Now if you're looking for a video on minimum wage, can I recommend that you go to my video which is entitled, I believe, Monopsony and the Minimum Wage. And you'll find a whole section there on the minimum wage and then how that works through into the monopsonist. But today we're looking at this whole notion of a maximum wage, which, as you well know, could be a cause of labour market failure. And so what we wish to consider here is, number one, is it a cause of labour market failure? And number two, does that then translate possibly into this whole notion of actually, if the government introduces a maximum wage, it moves more towards government failure than market failure? So let's get stuck into the theory and the diagrams in the usual way. So first of all, what is this whole notion of a maximum wage? Why impose it? Well, we've got very senior executives in this country and globally nowadays who are walking off with tens of millions, if not in some instances hundreds of millions of pounds remuneration with regard to their wage. And yet we have other people globally who are in relative poverty, absolute poverty, not able to provide those simple bare necessities. And so might it be the case that it would be appropriate to introduce a pay ceiling from some of the slightly obscene and some might say slightly immoral wages that some top senior executives are actually earning? So the whole point of this is to limit their maximum wage, put a ceiling on it, and hopefully that will help to reduce wage inequalities. Now, of course, the government acts at the other end of the spectrum because, of course, we do have a minimum wage in this country, about to go up to £7.83, as you well know from the most recent budget. So that's being lifted up at the bottom. So if we're lifting things up at the bottom, why not push things down at the top in order to narrow the differentials between the top earners and the bottom earners? Because, of course, for sure that is bound to at least reduce the jealousy, resentment, and maybe improve morale in the economy as a whole. And we'll discuss those points when we come on to the various pros and cons. So let's consider the diagram. Very straightforward diagram, very similar to the maximum price diagram, which I'm sure you're familiar with from AS and GCSE economics. So here we have the demand curve for labour. Let's not forget that we're also referring to this at the moment as the marginal revenue product of labour. So downwards from left to right, standard, and supply curve for labour sloping upwards from left to right. Here we have the equilibrium, where demand meets supply, and then the government comes in and they say, okay, let us introduce this pay ceiling. So the pay ceiling is the maximum wage, above which the wage cannot travel any higher. And so here's the maximum ceiling. So if we take that across, few things to notice, few basic things. Number one, you can see that this is the supply of labour at that given wage, and you can see that this is the demand for labour at that given wage. So you can clearly see that the demand for labour is much greater than the supply, and so one of the first things that arises out of this, in theory, would be that you would get a shortage of a particular type of labour in a particular sector, possibly. You get a shortage of labour because of the consequence of introducing this maximum wage. And as you know, when demand does not equal supply, as is the case here, this is referred to as disequilibrium. And of course, there are lots of labour market failures which cause disequilibrium, and this is just one of those particular causes. Now, if this were a free market, of course, given that the demand is greater than the supply, well, that excess demand would bid the wages upwards, theoretically, until the labour market cleared again at the equilibrium of W star. But that's not allowed to happen because the government is interfering in the market and introducing this ceiling. So let's just consider this diagram in a little bit more detail. The demand for labour at this point here, where we have the maximum wage, the demand for labour is very high. But of course the workers aren't being paid the necessary wage, the necessary returns for them to supply that amount of labour. Because really, in reality, that amount of labour will only be supplied if the wage is up here. And so it's no wonder that we get this excess demand problem. So that's the first point to note. And then the second point is this. Top senior executives are few and far between, let's face it. And so we're not talking about a lot of people here, although we are, of course, talking about the people who put into the UK tax system around about a fifth, probably, of all of the income tax collected in this country, as David Smith was writing about in his most recent article. So we certainly don't want to force these people out, even if it's from a selfish point of view of just holding on to our tax revenue. But the MRP of that person, this supply of labour, these very talented, very skilled senior execs, they do have a very high marginal revenue product. And when you introduce this maximum, you're obviously forcing it down, because that would be their wage, wouldn't it, at that point? You're obviously forcing it down from there down to here. So you are paying them a lot less than what MRP would say that they're actually worth. And if you were a senior executive, you can understand that you might think to yourself, well, this doesn't look right, this isn't fair. And I'm a highly mobile individual, so what I will do is I will buzz off to another country where they don't have a maximum wage, and I will earn my tens or hundreds of millions of pounds in that way. So that's the diagram. Let's now consider, ladies and gentlemen, the numerous advantages and disadvantages, some of which I have just mentioned. So, what is the impact of this? And are there any government failures? Are there any unintended consequences? Well, number one, it will narrow wage differentials. If you say to your workforce, your employees, okay, I'm the senior exec, and I will only pay myself 10 times what you earn. Well, there are a few benefits to that, aren't there? Number one, there's less resentment, as we mentioned. Number two, in order to narrow that, what might be a very significant differential, you'll have to bring the wages up as these ones are coming down, and so it will reduce the inequalities, but also help to bring up the wages of the most poorly paid. So that would be a plus point, obviously. We've talked about the resentment. We talked about in previous videos this whole notion of efficiency wage theory. Pay somebody more, they feel a bit more valued, and therefore they contribute more and they work that little bit harder for you. So in that respect, it would obviously be a good thing. But there are all sorts of disadvantages to this whole notion of a maximum wage, particularly if you in the UK introduce it, but nobody else does, because all of your top execs will just buzz off, and with them goes all of their entrepreneurial flair, skill, risk-taking, innovative skills, tax revenue, as we've mentioned. So there are all sorts of problems. So I'm just going to move the camera along, ladies and gentlemen, just so you can get a little look at the problems that we may discuss here. Sorry about this. So I hope that's clear to you. So, firstly, talked about this, executives move. Obviously, if executives move out, of course that's going to create a shortage of these senior executives, risk takers, people with entrepreneurial flair and spirit. The amount of risk-taking falls. Well, what does risk bring in an economy? It brings reward. We need these people in the economy to grow and develop our economy. Thirdly, we've just seen Mr. Elon Musk of Tesla, fame and fortune, being awarded, I believe, and it was published on Tuesday, Wednesday of this week, the largest share options in history. I can't remember how many billion it was, but it's a very substantial amount. Now, one of the ways that companies will get around this maximum wage is, well, okay, we'll limit your wage, we'll give you the maximum wage, whatever that may be, whatever the level is, and then we will give you a whole enormous chunk, barrel load of share options. So you just get around it in that way. We've talked about the fact that they may move abroad, so you need international cooperation. This does not work if you just do it in isolation. And of course, there are certain demand and supply considerations here. You can't just do this to all senior executives because some of them, the economy needs these people. And the demand is very high, they're in short supply. Let's just accept the fact that they're going to earn, because of this whole notion of transfer earnings and economic rent, which we talked about previously, they're going to earn significant financial returns.
Go to the music department. Thank you.
How do you determine what is the appropriate level for the maximum wage? I mean, that's a very difficult thing, isn't it? We've been talking recently about, well, what's the appropriate level for the minimum wage even? So how do you determine how many millions, how many tens of millions, hundreds of millions, what's appropriate for a given senior exec in a given industry? And of course, all of this, as all of these types of policies do, they all require some sort of monitoring. And so that there's a potential opportunity, there's a potential cost to that, financial cost, and hence opportunity cost, because the government could be putting that maybe into projects which are much more worthwhile, and they don't have the associated unintended consequences of a policy like this, whereby you are forcing out your most senior executives. That is, of course, what we mean, ladies and gentlemen, by unintended consequences. You don't think what the worst case scenario might be. So, all sorts, ladies and gentlemen, of problems with a policy like this. And some advantages, yes, but you'd have to say, and we talk about the whole notion of evaluation and discussion, and we talk about on balance, evidence suggests that. Well, you'd certainly have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that if we're thinking of the pros and cons of such a policy, you would have to say in this instance that it's clearly the case that the cons do outweigh, or certainly would appear in theory anyway, to outweigh the advantages. Okay, ladies and gents, I hope that's been of use. I'll put a link in the description below where you can find some videos on monopsony and the minimum wage, and I look forward to carrying this series on probably next week with regard to labour markets. If you've managed to watch to the end, thank you very much. Do click the bell there so you get any notifications with regard to uploads in the future. If you'd like to contact me, you've got any questions, geconomics.co.uk/contact. Do send me an email or follow me on Twitter at @G_economics. And as ever, I'll do my very best to get back to you. Bye for now.